Good morning, everybody. Today's the 5th of May. Welcome to our Tuesday morning catch-up to discuss everything that's of importance to the tourism, hospitality and retail sector. Welcome to all the members of Tourism Top End, Tourism Central Australia, Hospitality NT, Litchfield Tourism, Katherine Tourism Group and East Arnhem Land Tourism Association. Welcome to you all, and Darwin City Waterfront Retailers Association. Thank you for taking the time. We hope that I hope you've had a great long weekend, and for those of you who can, have a bit of an unwind and a relax. Fantastic. Important note, this has been a forum that has been highly valued by our industry, and this is it's come to our attention that we now have certain people listening in on this conversation and joining this conversation to then go away and report upon this within the media. We saw that last week. So we are now, as a collective, invoking Chatham House rules. Chatham House rules, for those who don't know, is that the information that's here is given for the participants of the membership of our associations to use, to consider, and to think about in the operations of their business, in the support of our industry. None of what can be talked about in this session today, as semi-public as it is, due to the circumstances of making it as easy for our members across the Northern Territory to be involved. None of this information today can be attributed to any of the speakers. Anybody who's putting that information or thoughts forward, their names are to be left out of this. So to any of our media friends who are involved in this, have found their way to here, we ask, please, that you respect our wishes as an industry. This is our opportunity to speak with our leaders in order for them to be able to have a frank and open conversation. If forums like this are hijacked by media writing articles out of this, we won't be able to have open and frank conversations with our leadership. So we ask on behalf of every tourism operator in the Northern Territory, you respect this process, and this meeting will now be going forward under a Chatham House rules. Today, I'll introduce our speakers, and it's fabulous that she's been so generous with her time, open with and sharing with her information, and giving it and seeking to take that information. So we're joined again today by the Honourable Lauren Moss, Minister for Tourism, Sport and Culture. Thank you, Minister, for joining us. Michael Bridge, Chair of Tourism NT, Andrew Hopper, CEO of Tourism NT. We're also joined by Mike Scott, Chair of Tourism Top End, Alex Bruce, Hospitality NT CEO, and with us for the first time today, g'day to you, Patrick Bedford, Chair of Tourism Central Australia, down in Alice. We can see you there pinned on the screen. Thanks for joining our forums. Mate, this is, and for everyone on board, this is a territory-wide weekly catch-up forum specifically around that which are the topics around hospitality, tourism and retail. So without further ado, we've got a few things today. We did have, unfortunately, he had to pull out over the weekend, Chief Minister Michael Gunner has, I understand it, a national cabinet this morning, and those are decisions we would all appreciate, right? Have a national consequence but impact heavily on the Northern Territory. We need him at those tables. So he has sent his apology. We will be endeavouring to get back to this group. I know that you will want to hear from the Chief on topics specific to tourism, retail and hospitality. So we'll be doing that. So I'd like to open to Minister Moss. We saw our first weekend of people getting out and about. So what are your thoughts about what we saw on the weekend? But also there's some announcements that we've seen come out in the media today. So I might hand that over to you.
Thank you. And I won't go through everyone again, but just wanted to say hello to chairs and CEOs and all of your members across the Territory. It remains a really valuable opportunity for me. And I know I'm not the chief, but I really enjoy coming and having this frank discussion with you guys and being able to take what I hear here and the questions you're asking and the challenges you're experiencing back to my colleagues. And I'll be having a chat to him too, and once we can line that up, making sure that he can get here. Just overall, I think the weekend that we've just seen has been relatively good. I want to acknowledge from the outset that obviously one of the first things to adjust in terms of restrictions was the parks and reserves, and that probably was much more seen in the top end than in Central Australia and across the Big Rivers region by virtue of the biosecurity zones. But I know that with the easing of some of those restrictions from lunchtime on Friday, a lot of our operators have tried different things and maybe had some soft openings. There's been some wildlife experiences that are planning to reopen for a local market, and I think that that's really positive and really exciting to see. But on the whole, for the parks and reserves that were open, we had all good reports. Police were out, rangers were out, and the reports back were all relatively positive about people, I guess, self-policing behaviour, which is really good. So if we can continue to keep that up, and we continue to see that we're not having any new coronavirus cases across the territory, I think that we are definitely on this pathway to the new normal. There are 30 cases of coronavirus that have been in the territory. We saw those 2 new cases, I think it was on Friday now, which was the ADF cases being treated at Royal Darwin Hospital. And just, to make that really clear as well, obviously the ADF have been working in partnership with police, have been working in partnership with government around border security and a whole range of other things, and it's absolutely the right thing to do to make sure that we are looking after them as well, and of course lots of Territorians as part of the ADF as well. So we remain the safest place in Australia, and I think that makes us puts us in a very enviable position, and certainly I know a lot of other jurisdictions have been watching as we started to adjust those restrictions over the last couple of days. It is the 3-stage process. You should have all received the roadmap from Tourism NT, but it is a 3-stage process. So the 1st of May on Friday, the 15th of May and the 5th of June. And we'll make sure that if anybody hasn't seen that roadmap, that we get that out to you. It's a cautious approach, but I think we all agree we need to take a cautious staged approach because no one wants to have to go backwards. And that would also have an extremely detrimental impact on business if we did, if people did open and then have to close again because we rush things. In terms of borders opening, unfortunately, that's not a date that I can give people. I'm not in a position to do that. We don't have a date at this point in time, and the Chief Minister's been pretty clear that borders are the last thing that will reopen. But around the Biosecurity Act and the zones under the Biosecurity Act, they are due to expire on the 18th of June, at which point the federal government, the NT government, land councils will come back together again to review that and see whether it needs to be extended and what the decisions are around that. And of course, we will continue to report back any information that we're aware of from those discussions. But again, I acknowledge how difficult that is for tourism and hospitality to not have line of sight of when the borders are going to open. But as soon as we do start to have some ideas around that, we'll let you know. And I know that Andrew's presented some scenario planning, and I think that's really important that we continue to do that. There is a tourism rebound task force, and I will hand over to Michael in a moment to talk about that. But this is in recognition of how big an employer tourism is across the territory, how important it is to our economy. And also I think it's incredibly important that we have some of those national perspectives and some of those national representatives in our corner, particularly as we continue to talk to Tourism Australia, as we continue to talk to the federal government about what the future looks like. Because as soon as those borders open, we want to be working with you to get visitors safely into your businesses and into the territory. But we also need to acknowledge that we're part of a national ecosystem as well. And I think certainly it's becoming more and more apparent how important the Northern Territory is to, I think, the recovery of the tourism sector across the country. So I think it's really important that we've got these people in our corner. We've got members from touring, accommodation, the accommodation sector, transport, and a range of others coming together to provide some policy advice around what the roadmap for tourism might be. And I might take that opportunity to hand over to Michael, who's going to be chairing the group, just to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Minister, and good morning, everybody. You may have read in the media this morning the Chief Minister and our Minister's announcement of the Tourism Rebound Task Force. Can I say up front that this is an initiative that was born from the Tourism NT Board and from the executive of Tourism NT, and really enhanced by the Chief Minister over the last week or so. We weren't actually pushing for a specific task force, but more or less a group that could interact with our tourism board and give us a national perspective on things. Thankfully, the Chief has realised the value of the industry and reacted accordingly and created this task force. It's very important to note that this is not a duplication of the Tourism NT board, and I want to make that quite clear. We have a board that is representative of the industry right across the Northern Territory, and who in all are very active and proactive with representing the various interests and the various sectors of our economy. And that is channeled through me into our Minister and into our department, and that will continue to be. My role in this new task force is to coordinate that level of expertise, that national expertise, and we felt it was very important for us to engage people that had a national perspective, a national reach, and probably most importantly, national influence. Never before have we faced some of the challenges we are going forward. We are going to be more reliant upon our domestic market than we ever have before. The Territory tourism industry has some peculiar differences to our other state jurisdictions around Australia. And two of the biggest ones that affects our road to recovery is the fact that firstly, we have the smallest intrastate or intra-territory travel component of our overall visitor expenditure. To December 19, year on year, was around 31%. That's about half of every other state jurisdiction in Australia, which means we can't just solely rely upon intra-territory to keep broadly our industry going. That represents great opportunity for us, and I've said it before, particularly whilst the borders are closed, and we'll continue to focus on our intra-territory and try and build that. However, every other state jurisdiction has a natural edge in that such a large proportion of their revenue is generated by themselves and intrastate. The other big peculiarity that the Territory has is the domination of business travel, and not just holiday travel across the Territory. So business is by far the largest supporter of visitation, and naturally we've seen that in the top end post-INPEX and the continual challenges our hotel sector have had, even when we've seen growth in holiday numbers. I think business travel is profoundly changed, and changed for the medium to potentially even the long term, and that's going to have some pretty significant effects back upon our industry right across the Territory. You'll read in the media today, I won't go into great detail, but happy to take take questions as far as some of the things that we hope to be presenting to the Chief Minister. However, just a few of the points I really want to raise, and this seems to be being missed in a lot of the media coverage that we're seeing and some of the positions of business at the moment. June 5 does not realise the end game and does not return us to a December last year scenario. The Prime Minister and the Chief Minister have made it quite clear on many, many times that we are facing what they are referring to as a new normal. And I don't think business can necessarily get overly excited about what is the new normal. And that's both from supply restrictions, and obviously the 1.5 metre rule, and Alex might even talk further about that this morning. But certainly the demand and the expectations of visitors, and in fact the general community, as far as being cramped together in bars, clubs, restaurants, cafes, tour buses, airlines, trains, ships, you name it. So they're the sorts of challenges we're taking on board in this task force. One of the other things that we really want to drive home is that whilst there might be changes interstate, inter-territory, specific changes over the next 6 months, at a period in time we need national standards. We can't have a situation whereby we have a ridiculous scenario, for example, of the GAN having to stop at the border and everyone changing seats and change our social distancing requirements here in the Territory because they might be different to an adjoining state. So we really need to push for what those national standards need to be, and in such a way that that can ensure that business is sustainable for the long term. The other thing that we really need to work on, and appreciating all the challenges that we have at a federal and territory level, is there is a genuine realisation that this, the tourism industry broadly cannot bounce back, cannot rearm itself in 2 weeks. You know, the hospitality industry is better armed to do that, probably not in 2 weeks, but certainly better than the level of the broader tourism industry. We do need months, and whether that's structural changes such as airline services, or whether that's things as obvious as branding and marketing and re-energising the demand, and likewise. So we need to be even more in front of the curve than what most other industries are, and we need to do so at a national level. Our domestic tourism represents about 80% of our total numbers. We're taking an attitude that international tourism is going to be challenged for a much longer period of time for all the obvious reasons, and therefore at this particular time can take a back step or a backward place whilst we concentrate on some of the national challenges and trying to get as many intra people travelling, as many domestic tourism visitors as soon as not only our borders but their borders free up. And then in a month or 2 or 3, we'll start looking at some of the challenges we've got internationally. So that's probably all I want to say at this stage, but happy to take questions throughout today's briefing, and I'll try and answer as many as I possibly can. Would you like me to hand to Andrew? Or?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, a couple of things have come up. What was the feedback from your feedback from the parks and from rangers over the weekend? Because that was a bit of a good litmus test on the weekend. And the other one is last week we saw some announcements following the Chief's announcements about different sectors and different information that was becoming available to them. Can I open? When can I open around these dates? And what are the, no, this is a big question. What are the rules that apply to my business? And it was, one of the conversations was around if I'm a transport business, if I have vessels or I have aircraft, am I 1.5 metre, am I 1 and 4? So there was some, when and where will that be coming, and how's that being worked through with motor vehicles, Department of Motor Vehicles and Health and Tourism. But how was the view back from the Rangers on the weekend?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So the feedback I received from the weekend was overwhelmingly positive. Territorians were as they've shown all the way through this, managing themselves very appropriately. Of course, the parks that were open were busy, as you would expect, but overall, very, very positive feedback, which was fantastic. And I think, you know, certainly I was nervous, maybe anxious even, all weekend, that we get through the weekend and show that everyone could manage themselves accordingly, and all the results suggest that they have, which is great. So that was really, really pleasing. To Glenn's question about transport, look, I think I'll start by saying things like buses, public transport, taxis, rideshare services, they weren't necessarily impacted by the original directions. The challenge we've got now as we move through these next phases is that there's probably more grey than there has been on the way in. So it's going to take us just a little bit of time to work through that. But certainly at the moment, as I understand it, if we're talking about a tour bus, there's certainly the ability for a tour bus to operate. There's an ability for tour bus to carry people. The challenge comes the mix of those people. And so if it's a family group of 4 and they're all sitting together, then that would seem to be appropriate. If there's another couple or an individual, then there needs to be a level of separation as per the physical distancing. Now, I appreciate more than anyone that is not straightforward. And I know that is not straightforward because every time I get asked the question, I've got to try and frame it in a way that makes sense. And it isn't easy, and there isn't one size that fits all. So all I can, I guess, do is encourage you to continue asking the questions. We'll continue to try and chase the answer. But in some instances, we haven't got a clear, specific answer. And I can only apologise for that, but I can assure you, whether it's transport, whether it's pubs and clubs, or maybe not pubs and clubs yet, restaurants, cafes, everyone's wrestling with how does this work for me when I've got a group of 5 versus a group of 20 or group of 30. So we've just got to keep asking the questions. We'll keep chasing the answers and share it as quickly as we possibly can. But Glenn, I think overall that the challenge there is that it's going to be somewhat of a moving feast.
Because I know for sure that's been the big feedback from our tour operators last week, was trying to understand what does that mean. And of course, all of our members are acutely aware of the commercial reality. It's all well and good to be planning where people are going to be sitting on their bus or boat, but is there a market there? Are Territorians likely to do that when they've got their own vehicle in their own houses and their own camping gear? So that's that's significant challenges facing tourism moving forward here. Patrick Bedford, we might throw to you down in Alice. How was the feedback in Alice on the long weekend and surrounds? And do you have any questions that you'd like to present?
The feedback was probably the camping, around camping. People were looking forward to going camping because it was a bit of a mixed message at the beginning. That kind of became clear on Friday with the Chief Minister's announcements. That was a bit difficult for a lot of people because they were excited because the top end could camp, and I think that's one of the biggest feedbacks was people were a bit annoyed that they couldn't go camping, but understandably with the biozones around Alice, that was a big restriction. But a lot of people did get out to Simpson Gap and a lot of places around, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. So it was good to have. We've had access to Simpson's Gap anyway, but they've got out and got a bit more adventurous in places where they can, which is great. Probably one of the feedbacks I'm seeing, and I've also had a few chats this morning, is around the Rebound Task Force, that there wasn't really on the ground representation from Central Australia, really. They would like to see somebody in a position that would give that general feedback, or at least keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on there. So that's something I think would be really great to see, that we have that person in Central Australia. I know Voyages and AT Kings have been, but we want someone more on the ground representing the tourism businesses here in Central Australia, membership, to be honest.
Okay.
I'm happy to respond. If you
Yes,
want.
please, Michael Bridge.
Look, guys, I hate to sort of state the obvious, but I entirely disagree with some of those comments that are coming through. This is a high-level group. You've got a Tourism NT board, a well-remunerated board that's working every single week, that is providing more feedback and more interaction with industry than ever before. You've got a minister here that sat in front of you in front of most weeks. You are missing the entire point of what this new task force is designed. This is not about protecting an individual business or protecting grassroots or protecting large businesses for that matter. This is a structural change. This is a new norm that we're talking about, and some of the policy settings that need to be implemented around that. I'm entirely comfortable that we have the appropriate level of people at the right level. If you feel as though you're not being represented appropriately, or that your views aren't being heard, one, you have your TCA and TTE, but you also have the Tourism NT Board. As I said from the outset, this is not a duplication of the TNT Board. We are meeting weekly and we are providing that feedback. We are looking after grassroots territory businesses. This is not about that. So I can say it again.
No, I appreciate the board you've put together as a great board, but 1 or 2 members from Central Australia would have been appreciated. That's all I'm saying. And then that's obviously been advocated here in the comments that are being made from Central Australia and TT. So I don't disagree that the board's a great board, but just 1 or 2 more members so that the voice from the 300 members coming from TCA, from Tourism Central Australia, is actually heard as well. The smaller operators.
But, you know, once again, I say there is no one. I'm not in the tourism industry as such in Darwin. Helen Martin is on it because she's representative of the Aboriginal tourism industry, which we see as vitally important to moving forward. You've got Peter from the Darwin Convention Centre, who is a renowned national expert. If we could have found someone better nationally, we would have. There is no Darwin businesses. If anything, we are probably more centric to Alice Springs, being Voyagers and AAT Kings. So once again, I sit very comfortably with the mix that we have right across the territory.
I don't think, I think we're all probably in agreement with the strength and the structure of the board. And when you know some of these people are on the board, they've been handpicked for their expertise in their relevant field. I don't think anybody has got a problem with that. And I think, and I completely agree with Michael, that, you know, for weeks we have had the benefit of the Minister for Tourism sitting here on a weekly basis that's now going out to about 130 people, including Catherine Times. But I think if we had any, if we had any input with this, it would be, given that we have got such, we've had such close ranks, and that the commentary in the newspaper was all about, you know, communication with the industry, it would have probably been better to have known about it rather than reading it in the NT News. I mean, we did hear about it a couple of days ago, but you know, perhaps you feel it relevant, perhaps you don't. But I think having been brought into the circle a little earlier than just reading about it, like anyone else, probably would have been preferential.
Could I just take this opportunity to remind everybody on here, and in particular, Mike made reference to any of our media friends. You play a terrific role in communications, but this meeting in particular, for us to be able to have these robust conversations, this is not for any. This is off the record conversation that no one here is able to be quoted. This is for the benefit of key stakeholders to have a conversation, and we need to do that in a forum. We can't do it in a closed room due to COVID-19. So please, for anyone here who is writing down names and thinks they've just picked up a bit of disagreement, you haven't. You've picked up some robust conversation and some sharing of thoughts, which is really important in the tourism industry and exactly what this forum is about. So I ask that any of you who are on this would respect that, and I think we might draw a line in that and then move forward. Let's draw a line moving that forward. Alex, Bruce, we've got a lot of hospitality members who are preparing for opening up shortly. What are their concerns, and what questions might you have as to this roadmap moving forward? And where hospitality, which represents for all the organisations, we all share members in the hospitality sector.
Thanks, Glenn. Good morning, everyone. I know we've put it in a pin in it, but I just did want to say that we support the announcement today. Having as many national and international champions for the territory will overall get us to a good spot, noting that the fundamentals have changed in our collective combined industry. A couple of weeks ago, we stood up the Hospitality Reopening and Recovery Task Force, and it's got operators from across the territory, restaurants, pubs, clubs, wayside inns and accommodation hotels. So we're more than happy and make the offer again, as we have over the weekend, to Tourism NT Minister, CEO and Board, that if there's anything in the weeds that they need to check, we've got a vehicle for our side of the patch willing to participate. That task force over the weekend has been looking at the draft checklist and guidelines that Health and DTBI will issue today for food-based businesses. We're not too sure how they're going to do the other sectors, like the beauty parlours and everything else that are opening on the 15th of May as well. But in terms of if you're a food-based business, you already have had to be registered with the Department of Health and get your certificate and all the rest of it. And environmental health checks is something that we're all quite used to, from a food stall or food truck right up through to food and beverage in large accommodation hotels. So all of those measures have not changed in terms of, temperatures of fridges and cleanliness of your food preparation areas and all those other protocols that environmental health has hopefully made you well aware of throughout the time. What we have seen is a relatively brief checklist overlay with additional COVID-19 measures, which we got some opportunity to provide some preliminary advice on. And it's in keeping with what we've seen is in keeping with the Chief Minister's comments when he made the announcement that he doesn't want an onerous structure set up for businesses. It literally is a web-based form that you'll be able to log on, satisfy yourself that you've updated your staff with regards to COVID safety, you've updated your hygiene and protocol practices, you've thought about in your venue, especially in the next 2 weeks where it's sit-down table service only, how you're going to structure your tables and your furniture to allow for patrons to socially distance. The signage requirements will all be there. And the guidelines do have some level of detail with all the curly questions that come out. No two businesses are the same. We're acutely aware of that. I'm sure there's still 1,000 questions about, well, what does it look like for me once you see the checklist and read the guideline? But, things like keep cups and in a market stall environment, allowing customers to hand up their plates so that they're not getting disposable ones. That's clarified in the guidelines. For the bricks and mortar side of the businesses, it's, there was all kinds of discussions about, well, does this mean we have to go to disposable cutlery and food and plates and constantly create waste? And all of that stuff's clarified in a way that we think is quite practical and pragmatic. The risk for us then shifts to the implementation of a relatively easy checklist and guideline to understand. And in all of that, we just continue to reiterate that all Territorians have a role to play in adhering to social distancing, not just venue operators, and not just customers, not just environmental health. So we do hope that there's quite a pragmatic approach taken, and that it's very much as checks are occurring throughout the Territory. You don't want to see a heavy-handed stick first up. This is a new norm. There are new processes and protocols, and there's been a lot of information overload for everyone over the last month and a half. So by all means, we will absolutely strongly adhere to and encourage all of our members to comply fully with all of the guidance. And we're just hoping that, it's more of a conversation with environmental health as they go through different businesses and maybe find that curly thing that might need to shift a little bit.
Thanks, Alex. And I'd like to take the opportunity. I recognise you've been doing an enormous amount of work on behalf of the hospitality sector in defining what this changing piece constantly looks like moving forward. Staying on the theme of the roadmap, I think one of the great challenges that we've got here is the implication around federal precincts, or what we now call biosecurity zones. And so we recognise that that's a challenge for our industry. We recognise that that's a federal decision, but there is questions here in regard to what communications are taking place and what are those steps that our tour operators in particular and our accommodation houses that are in around the fringes or within, what kind of notice would they be expecting to gear up to? I think part of that is what communications are happening with the feds, that it gets to a point that we know, okay, so for a biozone, we think it will be a month or 2 months once we've got to this marker. I'm not too sure who can answer it. Chief Minister's been announced by the Prime Minister as leading the task force around biosecurity from the outset. This is happening at a national decision. That information gets fed back into us, to the Territory. what support or advice can we be giving our tourism sector around when it comes to operating around federally managed mandated areas?
Yeah, look, that's probably a tricky one, and I might hand over to Andrew in a moment. But as I said earlier, we're looking at the June 18 date at the moment as being the expiry of the current biosecurity zones. And it's not just a Northern Territory government, federal government conversation, it's obviously land councils as well. So at that point in time, they will need to review whether it's an extension or of the biosecurity zones or a gradual easing, I guess, of the biosecurity zones, at which point, once those decisions are made, we would be, of course, letting you guys know who are around biosecurity zones and impacted by them. But it's a bit of a three-way conversation at the moment, because the land councils obviously are heavily involved in those conversations, and we're leading the way really in terms of making those decisions early. If you look at one of the first places was the Tiwi Islands. That was a decision taken by their local council around not allowing people in and out of the Tiwi Islands. So, Andrew, I don't know if you've got anything to add about, how the information might come out of that.
Yes, thank you, Minister. I think, I think in all of these situations, and whether it's tour operator or a cafe, I think everyone would love some advance notice. And I think we'll certainly be all working towards that. But at the same time, with so many groups or stakeholders involved, we're not always getting that luxury, because the desire is to ease restrictions. But to ease those restrictions, quite often the work that goes into easing them takes time, and progress can happen relatively quickly late. So we'll certainly be flagging that if the 18 June expiry is going to occur, it'd be nice to get some notice earlier, acknowledging there'll be caveats around that and whether the circumstances change. But certainly we'll advocate for that as best we can and pursue that. And equally, as we're trying to do now, as restrictions are eased, we're trying to think of all the different questions that people will ask and what does it mean for their business. So we'll continue to try and foreshadow what these restrictions might mean in those specific areas, if anything at all.
Okay, part of it, one of the other questions here and moving forward is related to, in fact, before I do that, Patrick, do you have any other questions? Because I know that in the Red Centre, the biosecurity zones impact tourism heavily in and around Alice Springs, and your business and that of all your members has been impacted by this. Is there anything that on behalf of your members you think you'd like to hear that you didn't hear there, or hear an answer on notice?
Not really, to be honest. I think it would just be clear communication of when we can, essentially we're restricted within 18 kilometres of Alice Springs in any direction. So we are kind of in a very tight lockdown. So, and I get that there's a lot of biozones around, but I suppose we need to kind of be very clear with communication of when we can get out to the West MacDonald Ranges, when we can go, to different areas through the biozones. There has been that kind of communication back saying, that it's very, very restricting for people. We still feel like we're under lockdown when Darwin, for example, can go to Litchfield and places like that. That's probably the main feedback from the members, is just that when can this happen? And as very clear as possible, communication from the government of when that's going to happen.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Patrick. The other question, which has been coming through thick and fast from members who have been very busy in putting in their applications for the whole range of different funds and grants that are available. One concern is that, yes, those deadlines closed pretty quickly. Those funds stopped quickly. And I think conversation, and we touched on this last week, didn't we, in our last week's session, that a lot of tourism businesses had been thinking of it possibly along the lines, and that it would have a date and then there would be a review panel. It wasn't a case of when the money ran out. So that was being communicated on the website, and sadly for many mixed. But the question around JobKeeper, because we certainly see every business that's been affected is a great lifeline. There's a mounting fear in the top end with our seasonality that's going to potentially come to an end in September. So has there been any thinking? Is there any other conversations? Is there some reserving of funds or strategies being put in place for post-September, on the basis that we in the top end, we'll be certainly going into then our traditional low season. Is there much conversation, or is it too early to tell? Is there getting much information back from the federal government, being it's their initiative?
At this point, I mean, again, Andrew could probably talk more at an officer level with the federal government, but we've definitely been making sure that Simon Birmingham and others are well aware of the reverse seasonality issue in the Territory. We have, I think I probably sat here a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago and said I was very confident that he definitely understood that issue and how it impacted on the Territory. And then, you know, we heard from Don Farrell the week after saying he also understood that. But I haven't really had too much formal communication back at this point about how that's going to be dealt with. But yeah, it's definitely an issue, and obviously with a 6-month time period, you know, I think we all acknowledge that for the tourism industry, it's going to be a much longer period than 6 months, and for some hospitality businesses, it's going to be much longer than 6 months as well. So it's a conversation we continue to have. It's not just the tourism and hospitality industries, I have to say. Creative industries are also finding, you know, JobKeeper's not really working for them for many reasons, many similar reasons around seasonality, but, you know, it's not working for a lot of different industries. And I think as well, we're hearing loud and clear from our industry here, you know, because we have a lot of smaller operators, you know, paying your staff until that first payment comes through is something that's really challenging for businesses as well. So we continue to feed that back, but I don't know if there's anything else coming through at an officer level, Andrew, that's different to that at this point.
No, thank you, Minister. No, at the moment, that's consistent. I mean, we're certainly anything that's not working, we're feeding it through. But I suppose in terms of being the masters of our own destiny, we're all watching carefully around things like borders, because that really will be a significant moment. But we'll continue to do what we've been doing, which is sharing information with the federal government and the relevant representatives where we're having challenges or things aren't working. So that won't change. Obviously, they're looking at that from a national perspective, but we are making the point that you know, really the top end of Australia is facing very different challenges as these restrictions start to ease and seasonality comes into play. And when I say the north of Australia, I include obviously Central Australia in that as well. I think that region, just like the rest of the Territory, faces seasonality just in different forms. So we'll continue to advocate for that need to be considered.
Mike Scott, do you have anything around funding grants and JobKeeper, and also this very vexed question around foreign visa workers? And we still haven't been able to, I think, nationally see a solution to come and help those guys that are now into many weeks of paying.
Well, that's right, and they're probably, you know, the international students and spouses of international students are probably some of the hardest hit, and probably the backbone, particularly for hospitality. It does appear that they're sort of the forgotten sector. Thankfully they're a resilient mob anyway, and they, you know, sort of they seem to go from day to day on, you know, on meagre amounts of pot noodles and rice. But it needs to be clarified pretty soon, because I mean, reopening. I mean, we've got the perfect storm. When I say we, putting a hospitality hat on, to be reopening at a time when we would normally see thousands of tourists on the street, being incredibly competitive, as Michael suggests that we will be as a destination against not only other Australian destinations but international destinations, and just having the means to reopen some of these restaurants because of the amount of wastage that was incurred with the 23rd of March lockdown. Yeah, it's going to be incredibly hard for some businesses, ourselves a Char restaurant included. So, you know, no staff, no money, no customers, you know, tough life, very tough life.
Did you want me to talk about the small business fund? And
Yes, please. So those other funds that are out there, Michael Bridge, and you've been involved in a lot of those funds and activities, putting those out, and we've seen, I think, I've got a sense that the deadline's coming sooner than later for businesses that haven't put in on that. And what are your thoughts on the update and what's available going forward, and what you're seeing and you're dealing with government as advising them around small business funds?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And obviously, Alex and myself are part of a dozen or so people that are sitting on that small business fund advisory board at the moment. Just on the visa worker and the lack of support through JobKeeper, there is ongoing support that can be used, doesn't have to be used, but can be used towards foreign visa workers under the third tranche of that. So just clarifying again, the first tranche that was released, I think on or about the 29th of March, I think it was, Alex, was about $20 million worth of money granted straight to what is now 1,500 businesses are falling under that support program, and that was to satisfy creditors initially to try and protect the supply chain. Then there was a second tranche which was available, I'm guessing now, I think it was about the 13th of April or something thereabouts, or was backdated to then, which again was another cash payment. And then the third part of that fund, which was the boost component, was based on full-time equivalents post the 28th of March deadlines at the rate of $500 per week per FTE. Now, it's important to note, and I've fielded a few questions, that these are people, to get an FTE under that third tranche, they have to be actively working in the business. Now, that's whether they're cleaning or painting, or they don't necessarily have to be serving food or anything else. And in most cases, what we're recommending businesses to do is those that are under JobKeeper and are actively working within the business, they form part of your FTE payment that will gain $500 a week, which will go to the employer to do what they so desire. Now, that's a pretty substantial amount of money that can then be distributed, if the employer so chooses, to visa workers. The total of those three tranches at 1,500 odd businesses is pretty close to $40 million. And as far as timeframes, we are actively moving that job fund into the adapt and rebound phases. We're now 6 weeks into that, and we think the survival phase needs to change into what, and I mentioned earlier, is the new normal, and how we make particularly hospitality and tourism businesses sustainable in the new norm. So that's what we're starting to concentrate on now, businesses that have to adapt both in the short term, but potentially have to adapt in the long term. And if anything, our real direction now, and where we see our initial challenges in the supply side, and Alex spoke about some of those challenges, more so than the demand side, and that will certainly be the case whilst our borders are closed. So the next $10 million out of that fund will be directed into ensuring that some of those 1,500 businesses are sustainable into the long term.
And it's fair to say, isn't it, Michael, that we absolutely need to encourage all tourism businesses to get their applications. If you are sitting, thinking, pondering, I'm still waiting to get this, upload that document. We heard last week that there will be a team that will work with you at DTBI. If the square pegs that you're putting into round holes and the answers, legitimately, if you're struggling to find that advice, get that in. Because it appears to me these things aren't going to be extended.
No, absolutely. Look, I very much doubt that this fund will be expanded or extended. But what I can say is that if you are registered as part of that, even if you haven't got confirmation or even if you're bouncing backwards and forwards, you are noted within those 1,500 people. Our general attitude has been, or certainly is now, if 6 or 7 weeks in, with the measure being a 50% drop in your business, if you haven't got around to putting this application in, it's probably no longer survival mode that you should be sort of playing in. It's above and beyond that, hence why we really need to start, particularly with easing of some of the intra-territory restrictions. We really need to start looking at the adaptation of businesses going forward.
Okay. Moving on to a couple of other topics. Michael Bridge, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about aviation. The Monday before, or in fact during that meeting, Virgin went into voluntary administration. We're hearing that there were a number of suitors. They had a $5 billion debt that's now been brought out to be a $7 billion debt. Are you hearing anything, being our man in aviation? Is there any things you're hearing that is not official advice? Have you purchased the airline yet? And when can Virgin be relocating here to Darwin with a branch office in Alice Springs, of course? But no, seriously, we know that at some point in the future, and we're a long way away, that having a competitive aviation space is important. It's great to hear, and I might add, the activities at Air North, now flying from Darwin down south, and the routes that they're picking up on. We hope that that continues and gets that coverage going. Are you hearing any more in the aviation space that you think is worth sharing at this point? Or it might be we're still waiting ourselves?
Yeah, no, not really, Glenn, other than sort of stating the obvious. The easiest way to make $1 million in aviation is to start with $1 billion. So there seems to be quite a few people with billions of dollars lined up at the moment wanting to acquire Virgin, and that will be a long drawn out process. I think it's important to note, and I think I did say it a couple of weeks ago, or might have even been last week, that I can't remember a time in Australian aviation where we didn't have at least 2 domestic carriers. So having the second carrier is a given, and I don't think anyone should be overly concerned about that. What we need to do is set the parameters, the restrictions, build the demand and the like to ensure that a second carrier can be sustainable. And that's a joint responsibility of government and of industry. And that's certainly, it's more so the case here in the Northern Territory, where we're so susceptible to aviation, both as far as capacity and pricing. So again, this is one of the things the task force is looking at a national level. How do we get our fair share of aviation capacity to ensure that we can bounce back? I'm certainly not hearing anything other than, there's at least 10, if not as high as 20 people circling. There'll be a lot of losers out of that as far as writing down what is close to $7 billion worth of debt. I'm quite excited about a couple of those potential parties just because they have vested interests. And I think those with vested interests might be able to make this stack up. Obviously, some of our mining magnates and the consortium they've put together have a vested interest in that, as do some of the big banks like Macquarie and the like, who are heavily exposed at the moment. So, I'm certainly feeling more comfortable about Virgin's future today than what I was a week or two ago. However, my initial comments still stand. Something has to change. Virgin have been an unsustainable business model for a long, long time. And we as Australians, and particularly here in the Territory, if we expect to have a second carrier with appropriate capacity, with appropriate pricing, we need to ensure that we've got the environment both from a regulatory point of view, but also from the demand perspective to ensure that they can be sustainable.
Great. Thanks. And Andrew Hopper, I guess there's planning, albeit with no real dates but discussions of how to activate Qantas and be ready for, if that's a year from now or 6 months from now, what we can be doing to get people flying in, to be getting off at the airport, getting on their tour buses and picking up their rental cars and motorhomes.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I mean, the easy answer there is yes, absolutely. It's not lost on us though that drive's a really critical component, and so and like many businesses right now, Qantas have also have staff on extended leave and other things. So we certainly know now from a lot of the work we've done during this turbo period the different types of campaigns that work. Obviously, if in the initial period there is only one carrier, that will change how we engage with Qantas. Equally, if there's changing consumer sentiment or travel behaviours, that will change how we do things. But at the end of the day, what we simply need to do is generate awareness, implement very, very good conversion activities with any partner, but particularly airlines, and make sure that we're ready. And I guess the challenge for everyone right now is, when do you need to be ready for? We talked last week about those scenarios and the different timings. We keep looking at those. There's some trigger points where we have to, or we should be starting activity based on typical booking patterns, and we're also looking at and trying to understand that there's some changing periods in which people book, not significantly, but certainly moving. But again, there's so much uncertainty. So some of that demand could be demand simply because people have travelling credit, and so it's seeming like they're going to take it, but of course no one knows when they're going to take it. So there's a whole range of factors that make it very difficult. But I guess all I can impress upon everyone on the line is that there is plans in place. We continue to monitor a range of data sources to see how people are behaving or planning to behave, but that's based particularly off what the mindset might be for those different consumers. And again, as people become more confident around Australia and more confident about Australia more broadly in travelling within, we know that there's going to be some demand. So we just need to be ready to try and capitalise when those changes occur.
Oh, good. Thank you. I might move to the chat. There's been some questions there in regard to the flowing of survival funds and are people achieving that. So the truth is, and we've have, and thank you for those who have shared that you have already received yours, because it has been a question from many. When are we likely to be seeing the arrival of those funds? So great to hear that money is now starting to flow. Fantastic.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, please, Minister.
Just to say, Department of Business has actually put extra people on, so they are actively trying to assess all the applications, and as you can imagine there are many, but they have actually put extra people on. So hopefully, if you haven't heard yet, you will hear soon. They are working through as quickly as they can.
And Rob Woods, I can see you shared with everybody there your plan, your health and hygiene policy. For those, thank you for sharing that. And that's what is just so extraordinary about these Tuesday morning forums, that we're all able to ask the questions, receive the answers. Sometimes we don't like the answers we hear, or we don't get, there isn't an answer because there just isn't an answer. So thanks for sharing that, Robert, and thanks to everyone else who's been sharing on that as well. Patrick, can I throw to you, is there anything else from Red Centre that you'd like to raise on behalf of members and or share?
It was just to Minister Marks around the Survive Fund. I appreciate they're under the pump. What I would ask is that a little bit more communication just comes out of when they're actually looking at that account, or how long people can expect, because from the very beginning it's been very open, as in all of a sudden you just get an email saying you're getting money, or so people are kind of a little bit nervous because they don't know how to plan for the next couple of weeks ahead, if they're going to get money, if there's money coming in. So that's probably all I'd ask, is that when they start assessing, an email to say we're looking at, and within the next 48 hours we'll come back to you, or something like that, to the members or to the people who have applied for it, because there was no communication. There was just basically, you've got money, and that's great, but if you know that 2 or 3 days you're getting money, it's just like, oh great, there's something happening, I can just relax a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Michael Bridge, what are your comments on? And thank you, Patrick.
Yeah,
that's really good.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And yeah, look, let me say it's been a big issue, right, across the territory with regards to that. We've Alex and I have been in many meetings where we've said to them, we've got to communicate better, we've got to get that messaging out to people. All people are seeing is really, yes, your application's been submitted, and that's about it. some of the challenges is that more than 2/3 of those applications, so over 1,000 of those, have had to go back to people seeking more information, more justification. Just short of 20% are actually being rejected at the moment for one reason or another, generally that they're not covered under the scheme more so than anything else. So yeah, we are feeding back as far as that time frame. I think people are conscious once DTBI are working with you, chasing information, etc. They're a lot more comfortable than literally people that have submitted and not heard. I guess all I can say is that the chances are if you have submitted and not heard, it's probably in the line to go through, as opposed to being rejected and or further questions required. Please don't take that as gospel, but that's generally been the situation, and they will work through those as quickly as they possibly can. As I said, if you have submitted, you're included within those 1,500. So please don't be concerned if you've got your email response saying that it's been received. Other than the fact we appreciate that you need the cash sooner rather than later, nothing else is required of you until someone contacts you or you see the money in your bank. So.
Okay, question there from Rachel Beaumont Smith. The announcement today that Slater and Gordon are commencing a class action to recover refunds. Do we know of any ACCC action in the NT? Andrew Hopper, are you aware of anything? I certainly am not aware of anything along those lines.
No, I think, thanks Ben, no, I'm not aware of anything in relation to the ACCC. I did read with interest Flight Centre's position over the weekend, and they've been working with the ACCC on their refund policy, or maybe refund policy that needs some tweaking, as it turns out. So at this stage, no, nothing for the NT.
Yeah, okay, and Alex Bruce, educating our public and our tourists for both for hospitality and tourism, that what they're walking into is not the business that they last explored when they went in, had a meal, had a beer, had a coffee, got on that tour, went into that attraction, stayed at that accommodation. I think the education of the public, and certainly between you and I and Patrick, our collective membership, and for all those represented, are quite concerned of what the public implications are when they go in and go, well, hang on, this isn't what I expected when I was last here. So I think that there's a comment there from Charlene down in Mataranka about that education for restaurants, and I'd extend that for tourism businesses. Do you have any thoughts on what needs to be done or what could be done?
Thanks, Glenn. Absolutely, that's the challenge for us. Territorians sometimes can be a laid-back lot. But having said that, there is a pretty broad understanding of what we've just gone through. I think that's why the government is doing the stages, especially in venues where it sit down first for a couple of weeks, iron out any kinks before they allow us longer sessions without meals, all the rest of it. Venues, operators, their staff will be doing everything they can, and there'll be signs and there are requirements that will ultimately rest with the licensee and their staff. But at the end of the day, we really need, and we understand the government's gearing up to do it, that the public messaging on all this stuff needs to be reiterated well beyond the 5th of June.
How many were? About 120 to 150. Okay, Mike Scott, do you have anything that you'd like to share or ask with the panel?
All good.
Rightio. Just quickly, there was a number of you. We're over 150 on board here for this conversation. At the start of it, there was a conversation which was announced in the media today about a tourism task force being set up, and I just wanted to, I think, leave what is the purposes and the objectives of this task force, so that we who have enjoyed the privilege of hearing a robust conversation, some questions and answers around that. What is the objectives of this task force moving forward? Because the impact of what comes out of this clearly advises the Chief Minister and Minister Moss as to what's moving forward. So if I can just throw that quickly back to yourself, and in closing, Michael Bridge.
Yeah, and rather than ad-lib as I did at the start, I might just simply read the 5 points as far as the areas of responsibility of this task force. And that's to provide a national industry perspective on what recovery may look like and advise the policy and support mechanisms of a national level. Feedback on the ability of businesses to prepare for the staged approach to the easing of national and international restrictions and the potential for changing consumer behaviour as it relates to tourism. Coherent advice on policy settings required to support the re-establishment of the tourism industry in the NT by government, with an aim to preserve and sustain sector employment in what may be a very difficult environment. Coherent advice on the role industry will play in the re-establishment of the tourism industry in the NT, with an aim to preserve and sustain sector employment, again in a very difficult environment. And an opportunity for the Chief Minister to seek advice on the potential recovery roadmap on what this may look like for the tourism industry. And that sort of encapsulates all those points I made at the start of the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Hopper, is there anything further you'd like to add at this point after what's ahead? Anything else in this you'd like to share?
Just thanks, Glenn. Just very quickly, Robert Wood's question around permits. There is a range of considerations across government with costs, and at the moment the NT Parks element is wrapped up in all of that, so that we can present government with a fuller picture to make that decision. So I do apologise, I haven't got any further update on that other than it is progressing, but obviously I'd like to be quicker, we'd all like to be quicker, but it's just one of those ones that's wrapped up in some broader conversations. But other than that, Glenn, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming together as we try and answer as many questions as we can. I know they're not always great answers, but certainly very happy to be here, take questions outside of here as well. And if you've got any dramas, either please feed those into myself or the broader team. Everyone's standing by, waiting to assist. So thank you.
A quick one there, Michael Bridge. 20% of the grant applications are rejected. 20% of grant applications are rejected. Will a second round of grants open?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Look, firstly, the $1,500 figure already took account of the fact that we're knocking back 20% at the moment. And let me be quite clear, the majority of that 20% are people that fit well outside the intent of this. Alex, I think we've had dentists, we've had accountants, we've had all sorts of people apply to this. Car salesmen. And whilst affected, we're not saying they're not affected, but they do clearly sit outside of this. I can literally guarantee you that not 1 cent of that $50 million is going to be returned. And it's really important that we move now into the adaptation and rebound phases. So if there are any underspends on the 40-odd million of grant payments through those first 3 stages, we will be using them in the adaptation and rebound stages. So there will not be a second round opening up that constitutes survival payments. And that's basically because we're 6 to 7 weeks in now, and we would have thought that anyone that needed survival payments are well and truly on top and at least have an application in.
Minister, is there anything final that you would like to raise?
Oh, just to say thank you again, and we'll keep trying to get as much information out to you as possible. The guys in tourism are still making hundreds of phone calls every week and trying to work through different scenarios with all of you as these new stages come in. So, keep the questions coming. We'll give you as much information as we possibly can, and thank you again. We really appreciate being able to come and have these conversations with you.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an agreement. We're just trying to find a date for James Finlay, Director of National Parks Australia, to come in and be able to talk to us about what's happening in Uluru, in Kakadu at this point, where we don't have access. What are works underway? What are their plans? He's agreed to that. We will extend that invitation, I think, also to Sally Egan of Parks NT, for her to come along and join into that, because it's critical to our future here. I'd like to thank everybody on this chat this morning. Thank you to all the members of Tourism Top End, Tourism Central Australia, Hospitality NT, Litchfield Tourism, Katherine Tourism, East Arnhem Land Tourism, Darwin Central Waterfront Retailers Association. Thank you to everyone here on the board. This is a super meaningful process, And last but not least, this new caveat that we have to put in. For those of you who are new to this forum, this is designed for the internal sharing of information so that people can use this in their information. None of this can be accredited to any individual who has given an opinion of you outside of this under a Chatham House rule approach. So thank you for respecting that. We look forward to seeing you, and we look forward to hopefully being able to get the Chief Minister back or here to sit down with his tourism industry alongside yourself. I understand he's got a really busy schedule, and I apologise to everyone that we put it out there that he'd be here. We understand that these things happen, but we surely would love to have him along. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Glenn.